When I made my first video, I mentioned that I didn't really have any specific end goal in mind when it came to learning Japanese. Instead, I just focused on finishing my daily Japanese lessons without thinking about how many years do I still have to do them for before I finally reach the finish line. However, I do look forward to reaching milestones during the journey. The current one being finishing my Core 2K 6K deck, which for me will signify a transition where I go from building a foundation to instead focusing entirely on immersion, which makes my next milestone probably something more exciting, such as reading my first novel entirely in Japanese. Now, of course, I could go and pick up a novel already today, but personally, I find it more interesting when my learning is segmented into separate stages. It's almost like a gamified approach to learning, where you first have to do the boring grind before you can finally move on to the more rewarding endgame. But okay, if I had to choose an end goal, then I would like to become fluent. But obviously that doesn't really mean anything because what people consider fluent is really subjective. So to be a bit more specific, I'd just like to become good enough to enjoy content in Japanese to the point at which it's no longer a frustrating experience. And while that requires some level of basic fluency, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be anywhere near native level. A good example of this is back when I was still learning English in 2010. Now, while my grammar and spelling were still absolutely atrocious, I was already primarily consuming English content and absolutely enjoying it. And not too long after that, in around 2012, I was already pretty much fluent, as I could consume any content I wanted without big issues. And while my output still wasn't perfect, it had improved to the extent that I could have conversations and participate in discussions and still be understood. And what's interesting is that I never even thought about it as learning English. I was just having fun and my English was naturally improving as a side effect. This is the level I want to reach with my Japanese. I want to be able to consume Japanese content because I enjoy it instead of consuming it just for the sake of getting better at Japanese. In fact, when I reach this level, I might actually be done with actively learning Japanese, as all further progress will just come naturally. And even though learning Japanese has been a positive experience for me, I don't want to be stuck with the responsibility of having to learn Japanese every single day for longer than it's necessary. And it's not like I ever used anything like Anki to learn English either. I did have English classes in school, but overall, the biggest contributor to my English proficiency has literally just been consuming a lot of English content. And while I absolutely respect people who go out their way to become as good as possible at something, I think that personally when it comes to Japanese, I'll be more than fulfilled just by becoming fluent but not as good as a native. I'm of course still not sure whether or not I'll ever reach fluency, as I still have a long road ahead of me. But to be honest, I'm looking forward to continuing the journey and facing all the challenges along the way. Because even though at times the journey can get really difficult, for me it has always been worth it, and I deem the journey just as valuable as the destination. But when it comes to language learning in general, I don't actually consider myself a language learning enthusiast. While right now I'm still interested in various language learning methods and experiences, I'm not sure whether or not that interest extends to the extent that I would ever learn a language just for the sake of learning a language. Although, while I'm obviously not leaving Japanese behind me anytime soon, if I had to choose the next language I'd like to learn, I am curious about picking up Chinese and maybe even getting back into Russian during my lifetime. Because just like with Japanese, there is so much mystery and things that I'm curious about locked behind those languages. But for some reason, I doubt that I'll ever be as serious about learning those languages as I am about learning Japanese right now. But of course, it's hard to predict the future as people and circumstances change all the time, so until then, I will just be enjoying the journey and seeing where it takes me.